While I was in Bordeaux, I visited Chateau La Mission Haut-Brion. So in this video, I'm going to do a deep dive into this legendary producer and share what I learned on my visit. Interestingly, even though La Mission Haut-Brion's wines were selling for at least as much, if not more, than the wines of all the other producers that were classified as second growths in the 1855 classification of Bordeaux, La Mission Haut-Brion was excluded entirely from the classification because it was not located in the Medoc. Indeed, the only Medoc producer that was included in the 1855 classification was La Mission Haut-Brion's neighbor, Chateau Haut-Brion. Nevertheless, in my opinion, La Mission Haut-Brion is arguably the strongest candidate to be elevated to first growth status in the event that the 1855 classification of Bordeaux was ever updated. In the meantime, however, many people treat La Mission Haut-Brion as a bit of an unofficial sixth first growth. Certainly in the marketplace, its wines often sell at a premium to those of the second growths in the 1855 classification of Bordeaux. That's certainly the case today, and it's been the case for more than 100 years. For example, with respect to the 1918 vintage, records show that in 2022, the wines of Lafite and Margaux were selling for 8 francs a bottle, Latour was 9 francs a bottle, and La Mission Haut-Brion was selling for 10 francs per bottle. The only first growth that sold for more than La Mission Haut-Brion at that time was Haut-Brion, which sold for 14 francs per bottle. But I'd be very interested to know your thoughts. So let me know in the comments below if you think either La Mission Haut-Brion or any other producer should be elevated to first growth status. La Mission Haut-Brion is a historic producer that traces its roots way back to the 16th century. Its name comes from the fact that one of its owners in the 1600s was the Congregation of the Mission. Fast forward a few centuries, and in 1983, La Mission Haut-Brion was acquired by Domaine Clarence Dillon, which owns the neighboring Haut-Brion. Immediately after it acquired ownership of La Mission Haut-Brion, Clarence Dillon wasted little time in upgrading and improving every single aspect of La Mission Haut-Brion. They started out by replanting the vineyards. After that, they overhauled the winemaking facility and added a new state-of-the-art vat room. After that, they added a new bottling line, and finally, they updated the chateau and the barrel room. So what is so special about La Mission Haut-Brion, and why can some of its wines rival the very best wines in the entire world? Well, there's a couple of reasons, but certainly it all starts with their exceptional terroir and their vineyards. La Mission Haut-Brion has around 29 hectares of vines. These vineyards are planted to about 25 hectares of red varieties and 4 hectares of white varieties. La Mission Haut-Brion's vineyards are located in the Grave appellation, which is certainly famous for its special gravelly soils. As such, it's no surprise that around 48% of the vineyards are planted to Cabernet Sauvignon, which thrives in these gravelly soils. But La Mission Haut-Brion also has a substantial Merlot percentage, a percentage that's actually been increasing in recent years. Currently, they have around 41% of Merlot. This may seem a bit unusual given the gravelly soils, but it turns out they actually have some clay subsoils beneath the gravel, and so Merlot performs very well here also. And they have around 11% planted to Cabernet Franc. And as mentioned, they also have 4 hectares planted to white grape varieties, specifically Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon, which are used to produce an outstanding white wine that I'll discuss later in this video. While La Mission Haut-Brion's chateau and that of Haut-Brion are extremely close to each other, just down the road in fact, it's worth keeping in mind that their vineyards are not so close. In fact, most of the vines for Haut-Brion are located in Pessac-Léognan, where for La Mission Haut-Brion, the vast majority of their plots are located in Talence, and only about 2 parcels are located in Pessac-Léognan. One of the reasons for the very high quality of La Mission Haut-Brion's wines is the stringent selection process that takes place both in the vineyard and the winery before fruit is determined to be worthy of including in some of La Mission Haut-Brion's wines. Certainly in the vineyard, the harvesters do an excellent job of making sure that they're only picking fruit that's worthy of being included in the blend. Once the grapes arrive at the winery, there's also a manual sorting process that takes place. After that, there's 2 levels of machine sorting. There's the optical sorting machine that you've heard about, but La Mission Haut-Brion also does density testing with another machine, and the fruit has to survive all of these stringent sorting processes before it's determined to be worthy of including in La Mission Haut-Brion's wines. Once La Mission Haut-Brion has determined the fruit that's going to be included in its wines, the grapes go to the winemaking team for fermentation. And it's worth noting that the winemaking team for both La Mission Haut-Brion and Haut-Brion is exactly the same, and the wines are made in exactly the same way. La Mission Haut-Brion's winemaking team uses a computer program to control the temperature for fermentation. They also use pump-overs as the extraction method, and they use their computer programming to control both the number of pump-overs as well as the duration for those pump-overs. Interestingly, the blending process takes place fairly early for La Mission Haut-Brion, specifically shortly after malolactic fermentation and before any barrel fermentation has taken place. This is so because the winemaking team believes it's better to do the blending before any oak influence is felt in the wines. La Mission Haut-Brion's winemaking team will mature the top wine for between 15 to 18 months, depending on the vintage, in around 75% new French oak, and they use egg whites to fine the wines. La Mission Haut-Brion has a strong record of consistently high-quality wines going back many years. You can't go wrong with any of the vintages from 2014 through the present. The 2022 vintage is on store shelves now. This is definitely one of the strongest wines of the 2022 vintage in Bordeaux. And while 100 years ago, La Mission Haut-Brion cost more than most of the first gross, today that is not the case. In fact, the 2022 vintage offers exceptional relative value because the quality is certainly comparable to that of the first gross, but the price is much lower than the first growth prices. For most of the 2022 first gross, you'll pay $500 and up, whereas the La Mission Haut-Brion in 22 sells for around $365 per bottle. La Mission Haut-Brion is a wine of intensity, power, opulence, and charm. Compared to Haut-Brion, it's typically a little bit more structured, in tannic, and opulent, but it's also capable of being enjoyed typically at least 2 to 3 years earlier than Haut-Brion. Typical flavors and aromas for La Mission Haut-Brion include blackcurrant, truffle, smoke, earth, and spice. When I visited La Mission Haut-Brion a few weeks ago, I was able to do a comparison tasting between the 2017 vintages of both Haut-Brion and La Mission Haut-Brion. At that time, the La Mission Haut-Brion was a little bit more approachable and expressive than the Haut-Brion, which was completely shut down. But both definitely need at least 10 to 12 years or so to show their best. In fact, my general recommendation for La Mission Haut-Brion is that many of the wines definitely show better with an additional 15 to 25 years of bottle age. Due to La Mission Haut-Brion's age-worthiness, as well as its long record of consistently high-quality wines, it's often worth taking a chance on back vintages of La Mission Haut-Brion if you can find some bottles that were stored properly. If you're talking about back vintages of La Mission Haut-Brion, some of my favorite vintages were 1982, 1989 and 90, 1995, 1998, 2000, 2005, and 2009 and 10. As mentioned, they use a fairly strict selection for the top wine. Typically only about half the fruit makes it into the La Mission Haut-Brion top wine. La Mission Haut-Brion also has a second red wine that's also outstanding and which sells for typically less than $100 per bottle. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. La Mission Haut-Brion also has a second red wine that's also outstanding and which sells for typically less than $100 per bottle. La Chapelle La Mission Haut-Brion made its debut in 1991, but the vintages from 2006 to the present are at a significantly higher quality level. This is so because beginning with the 2006 vintage, they started to include the fruit that used to go into Latour Haut-Brion into La Chapelle La Mission Haut-Brion. The fruit that goes into this wine typically consists of the fruit from some of the younger vines on the estate, as well as from some fruit that's determined not to have the quality necessary to make it into the top wine. Typically, this is a Merlot-dominant wine. The 2022 vintage, for example, has around 56% Merlot, 36% Cabernet Sauvignon, and the rest is Cabernet Franc. This second wine is definitely one that you can enjoy much earlier than the top wine. La Chapelle La Mission Haut-Brion makes an excellent cellar defender, and it should be one you can track down readily, as they produce about 4,000 cases of it annually. Unfortunately, La Mission Haut-Brion's excellent white wine, which since 2009 has been called Chateau La Mission Haut-Brion Blanc, is much more difficult to locate because they only produce around 550 to 650 cases of that wine annually. La Mission Haut-Brion has around 4 hectares of vines that are planted to 63% Semillon and 37% Sauvignon Blanc. Those vines average around 41 years of age. To produce La Mission Haut-Brion Blanc, they ferment the wine in barrel and then they mature it in 50% new French oak for between 8 to 10 months, depending on the vintage. Due at least in part to its relative scarcity, this is a wine that costs much more than the top red wine typically, and it's very difficult to find it for anything less than $500 per bottle. There's also a second white wine of sorts, but that second white wine is made from some of the fruit that does not go into the top white wines for both La Mission Haut-Brion and Haut-Brion. This is so because there's not enough fruit for them to produce their own second wine independently. So they combine that fruit to produce the wine that's called Le Claret du Haut-Brion Blanc. This is a wine that will typically sell for between $100 and $120 per bottle, depending on the vintage. If you'd like to learn more about La Mission Haut-Brion's neighbor, Chateau Haut-Brion, please be sure to check out this video that's linked above.